In this week's podcast, I interview Denise Shull.
All this trading psychology about take the emotion out of it, and if you could literally do it, you wouldn't be able to make a trade. You'll still hear all kinds of people talking about your old brain and your limbic system. But scientists at the forefront don't talk like that. I think one ought to be monitoring themselves almost as much as they're monitoring the market. Because at the end of the day, the profitable trades are, a combination of the market and your ability to execute. In other words, it's at the psychological edges that make the difference in the mathematical edges of your profitability. At the end of the day, all anyone actually cares about is an accurate prediction of what someone else will pay for whatever you're long or whatever they'll sell whatever you're short in the future. If you could know the answer to that, you'd throw out all your charts or all your analytics.
From the outside looking in, it can sometimes appear that peak performers have an elusive talent or skill that sets them apart from the rest of us. However, what usually sets peak performers apart isn't what they can do, it's what they will do. You are listening to the Trading Edges Podcast, the podcast dedicated to seeking and sharing the best ideas and principles from peak performers across all domains of performance and achievement to help you discover your full trading potential.
Greetings everybody, this is Houston and welcome to episode 24 of Trading Edges. In this week's show, I sit down with Denise Shull and we have a fascinating conversation around the science of emotions, feelings, and trading. Now, Denise is well known for her book, Market Mind Games, and if you haven't checked it out yet, I would definitely recommend picking up a copy. And she's of course well known for the work she does with traders, integrating the science of neuroscience and decision making. Time and time again, we've explored on this podcast the importance of integrating emotions and feelings into our trading. And unfortunately, there's still a school of thought out there that still believes we can somehow compartmentalize or suppress our emotions while we trade. And although this line of thinking is probably well-meaning, I think it can be very damaging to many traders. The reality, as Denise mentions on the show, is that it's biologically impossible to have thoughts without emotions. So rather than try to set aside our emotions, we should instead harness them to better understand not only our behaviors, but the intentions of other market participants, i.e. the folks we're trading against. Ultimately, trading is a lot like a global poker game. So, rather than the game being solely about trying to predict price, what if you came to the understanding that the determination of price might be more of a social question than one of mathematical probabilities? And if that were the case, then your ability to tap into your emotions and feelings can indeed become a psychological edge. As always, I hope you enjoy the show. You can find the show notes, transcripts, and resources at thetradingedge.org/24. And if you're enjoying these podcasts, then I'm doing my job. So please help me by leaving a positive review on iTunes so that our message can reach other traders. Now, on to the show. Welcome everyone to episode 24 of Trading Edges. And today's guest is a trader performance and psychology coach. She's also the author of, I think, a real groundbreaking book called Market Mind Games, which came out back in 2012. I've been a long time follower of hers, and I'm really excited to have her on the show today. So, on today's podcast, we have Denise Shull. Hi, Denise. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Of course. It's great to have you on. So, I always ask our guests just to give everyone a bit of a background on how they got into trading. So, why don't we start there? So, how did you get into trading, and how did you get in the world of actually studying trading psychology and then getting into coaching traders?
Well, I often forget to say this first part, but my father was a very serious buy and hold investor. So I was exposed to the market from at least grade school, but he really did buy and hold. He didn't sell anything. And then when I was in Chicago in my late 20s, I played volleyball with a group of guys who were floor traders. So I kind of found out about trading and the Chicago floors from then. But I then went to graduate school intending to either be a psychologist or be a researcher. And I did a master's degree in basically neuroscience and how unconscious thought happens. That was essentially, Chicago has a program you can design your own. So
fascinating.
I was doing that when these guys from the floor were some of the first guys to go upstairs, as it was called, back in 1995. And they said, they had tried to get me to come on the floor and like buy a weather futures seat. And I was like, what on earth is a weather futures? Weather, I understand that word. But in any event, I agreed to keep track of their P&L intraday. And as it turns out, it was in a prop firm and they had a training program. And sure enough, within a few months, I found myself trading. And so I finished my master's degree, but didn't go on for the PhD. And then traded for a few years, traded at a company called Schoenfeld, and then moved to New York to put together a prop desk in a NASDAQ market making firm. So the whole neuroscience thing was just like this other career that had nothing to do with the trading for quite a few years.
And how did you find yourself actually integrating those two? Because now it seems like such a natural fit now that we've kind of progressed along a bit, but how did that come about?
So in 2003, I was trading at a prop firm, but I also was taking classes at an institute for psychoanalysis, which there are a lot of in the world, even though people don't realize it. It's kind of under the radar, in the evening. And that institute knew about my master's paper, and they asked me if they could publish it. And I said, well, yeah, that'd be great. I mean, I'd be really honored, except it's neuroscience, and so it's now like a decade old. So in any event, we ended up updating it. And when I was doing the research, the basic decision research was showing that no one could make a decision if they lacked emotion. So like there are people who, like, parts of their brain that generate emotion are damaged in a way that they have really no emotion. And so those people can't decide what to wear, what day to make an appointment. You can't make a decision at all. And I was like, well, darn. All this trading psychology about take the emotion out of it, and if you could literally do it, you wouldn't be able to make a trade. And I was sort of like, that's a problem. Like, we have to somehow figure out how this really works. So I was just talking to another trader I knew who about it, and he said, you got to write an article. And I'm like, yeah, who's going to publish an article by me? And the next thing I know, he hooked me up with an editor, and I wrote an article about what I knew about emotion and risk decisions. And that it just kind of took on a life of its own. But the core of what I think made the difference is traders said, oh, I thought it was just me. I thought I was the only one who, and I didn't want to tell anyone. And so then I basically knew I was on to something. So I kept reading the research and talking about it more and writing about it more. And more people asked me to talk about it and write about it. And here we are. Yeah.
What I appreciate about your work is that, it's not just academic, it's kind of steeped in, in the world of trading. So, it's one thing to just pick up a bland paper that just talks about, maybe emotional, how the emotions work maybe, inside the brain, but then to actually layer it on to trading and having just that great, trading perspective and background, you really made it come to life for me anyways. So what does the work that you do with traders look like now? So do you coach, I guess, who do you coach, and what's the kind of work that you do? Can you describe that?
Well, yes, I think of it as teaching and coaching, or training and coaching.
Okay.
And first of all, it's the whole gamut of traders, from bank traders to hedge fund traders to, I like to call them semi-professional traders or independent professionals. But at its core, it's about developing an emotional awareness that's germane or specific to risk. Now, that is implicit in that is a self-awareness that can be used outside of trading.
Yep.
And then to break that down, it's becoming aware and being able to categorize all the sorts of different feelings one has in trading.
Yeah.
And then knowing more which feelings are intuitive or unconscious pattern recognition and should be paid attention to, and which feelings mean that you need to manage your risk, at which point that risk is probably mostly you.
I find it interesting because for a long time, and the message is still out there, that we need to control or maybe in some way repress our emotions. But it seems like the tide has kind of turned a bit now. People are a lot more receptive to this message that, you know what, we need to be actually listening to our feelings and emotions. When did you feel that kind of tide turn? Have you noticed that as well?
I've definitely noticed it. I mean, I did my first webinar in 2006.
Yeah.
January of 2006, no less. And so, exactly 10 years later, it's so different.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the tide changed just in the past couple of years. 2013. I mean, I've seen articles, and I'm not going to be able to cite them, but I've seen articles on LinkedIn, for example. I know I saw one about how you have to use emotions in your decision making. And related to that is, like in 1995, there were maybe 5 papers published on emotion in the research. And last year there were 5,000.
Right. Yeah. And I really find it amazing because this, like you said, the speed of change is happening so quickly, because the research is advancing so quickly that even just a few things that you read maybe less than 5 years ago seems to be out of date now. So, the old model of how we think about the brain and such is not necessarily true anymore, right? Like the kind of triumph model of the brain, for instance.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you'll still hear all kinds of people talking about your old brain and your limbic system.
Right.
But scientists at the forefront don't talk like that.
Yeah.
They say it's a completely integrated, reciprocal system, and you really can't have thought without emotion. And you might be able to have emotion without thought, because there is evidence that emotion actually stems from your brain stem. And there are children who have no more brain than a brain stem, and they appear to feel emotion. But for the purposes of judgment and decision making, you really can't pull apart thought and feeling, and use one without the other.
Yeah.
So the whole old brain idea is old.
It's old. So getting brass tacks, so what's the applicability there? So you said, we really can't make a decision without actually involving our emotions. So how does that really, how should we be thinking about that as traders? So,
it means that, for one, effort to set aside your emotion.
Yeah.
And purely that, like, I'm going to set aside this emotion, is probably ultimately going to be ineffective. And that appears to be because at its core, the emotion is some sort of signal or some sort of piece of information that some part of your brain wants you to have. So the more effective way is to say, I'm going to try to be aware of all of the different feelings I have and understand the pieces that are informational. So those pieces would be about the here and now. And in research terms, that's called integral emotion, integral to the decision.
Yeah.
And, there are other feelings I have that are incidental or not germane to this decision. And those feelings may be about other things in your life going on, or they may be about things from the past. But it's much more effective to try to invite the feelings in, or invite awareness to them, as opposed to try to set them aside. And ultimately, it becomes easier to do what seems like rely on your thought. It's not what appears to be relying on your thought is actually easier to accomplish by making friends with your feelings than trying to stay enemies with your feelings, because the feelings will tend to get bigger and more intense and will eventually win the battle.
So true. So true. And so what is it? Is it a matter of, what model do you use to do that? Is it a model of just basically cultivating awareness in the beginning, so you can begin to, be able to recognize the feelings and emotions as they begin to pop up real time? What's the model to begin to develop that awareness?
First, you have to decide that you want to do it.
Yeah, sure.
Second of all, you have to be willing to tolerate discomfort. And be willing to tolerate, maybe I'm going to call them messages that might not be all that attractive to you.
Right.
With the realization that, as much as feelings and emotions can be informational, they can also be fleeting. Because they can come from so many sources, or so many provocations or instigators or input sources. And, when people have spent lifetimes setting all this data aside, it's kind of a spaghetti bowl at first.
Right.
But so the model is it's really acceptance and investigation. And I liken it in, I have a coaching client that I just likened it the other day to, it's like learning a new sport, and that sport being complicated like golf.
Okay.
And there's a lot of nuance that you gain awareness of.
Yeah. And then, for instance, during, let's say, a trading day, is it just a matter of a trader, kind of tapping in and just kind of checking in with themselves on a regular basis to see, those feelings and emotions? I think you call them your feeling context and your emotional context. Is that the idea? And just making sure you kind of understand what's happening there, so you don't run kind of unconsciously throughout the day and just react to whatever comes up.
Well, I think one ought to be monitoring themselves almost as much as they're monitoring the market. Because at the end of the day, the profitable trades are, a combination of the market and your ability to execute.
Right.
And so it is, there is a very athletic-like and energy, dimension to it.
Yeah.
So knowing what feelings are operating, before the trade, during the trade, after the trade, before the next trade, during the trade, after the trade. And the more one can get into the habit of knowing what feelings they're having in real time, and then where they're coming from. So, and which ones feel like information or intuition, and which ones feel like impulse or reactionary.
Yeah.
So, it's easy for people to start out feeling a little nervous, and so then they don't take the first trades, and then they're frustrated because they missed something. They didn't trust their intuition.
Right.
Felt like they really wanted to be right. Then they miss it. Then they're frustrated, and then because they don't fully embrace the frustration. Then what tends to happen is they take a second marginal trade.
Yeah.
Why did I do that?
Yeah.
Well, really, it's because you didn't process the first trade that you didn't take, which is really because you didn't process the fear or believe in the pattern recognition you had. So It's like one feeling leads to an action, which leads to another feeling, which leads to another action. And the way to interrupt that cycle is to get really inquisitive about the feelings. And believe it or not, just verbalizing them, saying, I'm nervous this trade isn't going to work, has the ability to take down the nervousness a notch. We're not sure why this really works from a brain point of view, but there's a growing body of evidence that simply says verbalizing the feelings and getting it right.
Yeah.
Getting the label right. So I talk to people about coming up with a spectrum. So let's say in the hedge fund world, it's a conviction spectrum. Outside of the hedge fund world, it may be a confidence spectrum, but it's kind of the same thing. So,
okay.
On one hand, you've got fear, anxiety, and doubt.
Yep.
On the other hand, you've got confidence or overconfidence, and there may be multiple points more than I've mentioned. But knowing where you are, and then being able to actually physically experience that feeling and put a label to it, even if it's just you talking in your own head or maybe you typing out.
Yeah.
That process, like putting that constant check and repeated verbalization, making it a habit, will actually reduce the number of times you act on the feeling, or it should.
Yeah.
Start to disconnect. See, the whole misunderstanding of feelings has come from like the misunderstanding that feeling and doing, they're not one thing. They're
right. Yeah.
They're two psychological things, and they don't have to be connected. And the problem is a lot of feelings have a lot of energy, but they oftentimes have a lot of energy simply because they're not felt, or because they have current and historical meaning associated.
Right.
And if you pull it all apart, the energy is reduced, and it's easier to recognize the informational feelings.
That makes a lot of sense, because I've played with that myself, just kind of trading out loud, as what I call it, where I'll just basically talk to my screen all day as I trade. And you're right, I'm just verbalizing everything that I'm feeling and seeing, and all the expectations that are coming out of my head. And I'm curious too why that works, but I definitely feel like it's kind of like releasing some of the gas out of that valve.
Right.
It just feels that way.
Yeah, so there's various experiments, and they're mounting now, and it's called emotion differentiation, emotion granularity, and there's evidence saying that the more people are able to get granular about their feelings, then the less their feelings will bias them.
Yeah.
So, I think we're a far ways from understanding like even how language really works.
Right. Yeah.
And how language is connected to our psyches. We just know that
it's just the tip of the iceberg, right? And then, so how far? So let's say you gain this awareness around your feelings and emotions as you trade during the day or whenever you trade. Do you also subscribe to then maybe getting even deeper and going at it from like a maybe a psychological perspective, or people need to begin to understand these deeper things that are causing these emotions and feelings in the first place? Do people need to go to that level and say, all right, you need to deprogram the stuff because it's it's creating these kind of limiting beliefs or all those types of things? Do you subscribe to that level of work as well?
I do. So that master's degree, that master's thesis is called The Neurobiology of Freud's Repetition Compulsion.
Okay.
And I only say that to say that means I was into like the deep stuff. But when I first started coaching, I wasn't so much expecting to go to that level. I thought it would be more just about like fear and anxiety in the moment about the trade.
Right.
Or fear of missing out, which is really fear of future regret. But one of the early clients that I had called me. He was a board of trade trader, and he called me and said, I have this long-standing problem I have not been able to solve. I make money. I make like $30,000 a month, but I start every day down somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000. Cannot stop it. And if I stopped it, obviously I'd make a lot more. And I just, now probably because I had psychoanalytic training, I just said, well, let's talk about your life story.
Hmm. Yeah.
And he told this story of being born to an impoverished mother, and not having a father, and how difficult life was when he was little, and then how he became an athlete and had coaches take him under his wing, and he became successful. So he had this rags to riches story of his life. And I said, well, after a few times, I didn't tell him when I first realized it, but after a few times I said, I think like all your feelings about your rags to riches story are like you're reliving them every day.
Hmm.
And he was dumbfounded. Like I think I sort of no sooner said it than he was sure that was it.
Yeah.
And we've been working together maybe 6 weeks, and I remember this very clearly. We started in May, and in June he made $100,000.
Wow.
And he'd had like 3 years of making more or less $30,000.
Yeah.
And it seemed to be that once he recognized that how this was connecting for him, he just didn't need to do it as much. It's usually not that easy for people.
Yeah.
But the reason I tell that story is because it's so clear, but also because whatever it is that we do over and over and over again that seems inexplicable almost certainly has a connection to meaning that we developed when we were, children or teenagers.
Right.
And so as you start to be able to see that, getting frustrated in a trade and feeling stupid per se, has to do with, something like, your mother never being happy that you got a B+, or, once people start to recognize these historical echoes, or now I do think they're fractal in terms of the way they work out, but you start to be able to cut the problem off at its power source.
Yeah.
So I think people can make progress without going there by dealing with fear of future regret primarily.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if people are willing to go there, they can really solve what seemed prior to that some unsolvable problems.
And it sounds like if it's repetitive and if it keeps happening over and over again, then maybe it has to be connected to something that you said maybe you've prescribed a little too much meaning to, that may have been useful to you in the past as some sort of coping mechanisms or whatnot, but may not serve you any longer.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, what kind of exercises or practices do you share with your coaching clients around, kind of improving that emotional regulation? What are things that they can be doing? Is it just a matter of checking in on a regular basis? What else can they be doing to make sure that they're not being overly influenced, so that those feelings aren't turning into actions?
Well, the whole physical dimension of trading, so sleep, exercise, diet, breaks, it seems like it's a mental endeavor of
right.
Just you against the screen. But that mental endeavor is actually a very physical endeavor. And so if you're, not well rested, or you've got too much caffeine, or you haven't taken a break, your physical body supporting your perception and judgment is compromised. So if the system supporting your perception and judgment is compromised, then your perception and judgment is unlikely to be as good as it could.
Yeah.
And certainly all of those physical things will cause you to either feel feelings more intensely or misinterpret their meaning. So, for example, lack of sleep is associated with misperception of rest.
Right.
And what it means is it just doesn't seem like that big of a rest. Like, when you're well rested versus when you're not well rested, the same exact decision will seem like less risk when you're not well rested.
Yeah.
So, I haven't been able to do this yet, and I don't know if I'll be able to do it in my lifetime, but I think the research is clear that the hedge fund that would both put a nice nap room in, well as like make it a good thing to use it,
Right.
their performance would go up.
Yeah.
But it's so antithetical to the work hard. And I am amazed in my coaching how people do how the work hard mentality
Right.
influences trading in portfolio management.
Yeah.
Like, it's really more of a work smart question than a work hard question.
And even though we know that intellectually, we still do it.
Yeah, well, largely oftentimes that's because first of all, there's pressure.
Right.
There's a feeling, many of us were given a feeling that we had to be working hard.
Yeah.
And then there's also the idea that, like, if I'm not in the market, I can't be making money.
Mm-hmm.
That's really a misnomer because, if you're in the market, you can also be losing money.
Right.
And so if you're not in the market at a good time for you psychologically, it's sort of like playing sport with a broken leg. And it's worse, not better.
So true. That's a very, very keen observation. I think, traders are so biased for action that many times we get in our own way. We're trying to do too much.
Yeah. It's really hard to get people to dial back and pick their best trades.
Yeah.
People like to be involved, and they think of these other trading psychology teachings, which say you got to be in every trade. Like, you really don't have to be in every trade.
Yeah.
Like, a computer can be in every trade. So a computer can trade a statistical system. Human being literally can't do it. So it's just it's a kind of a waste of energy.
Yeah.
Likely to lead to not so great results.
So what other kind of habits can kind of peak performers be cultivating to improve their emotional edges? So you talked about getting proper rest, proper nutrition, kind of taking care of the body. Do you see any other attributes from some peak performers that you work with?
Well, I do think, I do think talking to someone about it helps. And that, I don't mean that to be self-serving from a coaching point of view, but I think it's a fact.
Yeah.
That with this odd form of information that's often hidden from us, that talking to someone about it brings insight.
Yeah.
So likewise, many people report that forms of meditation help them, and that can be sort of standard meditation, but it can also be other forms of just solitary activity that allow you to be in touch with yourself, riding a bike.
Going for a nice walk.
Yeah, just something that allows peace and quiet and for you to be able to hear what's inside of yourself.
Right.
But the clue is to start to integrate these things, on a regular basis, like a habit.
Yeah.
But to do that, people have to believe that it's important to judgment and decision making in market risk.
Right.
It's really easy to forget how important that is when it seems like this probability numbers game.
Right. So talk more about that, because I know that you speak about that in your book about the perception that it is just a probabilities game, that if I just take enough trades and have a positive expectancy, then everything should just work out. But we end up being the limiting factor there.
Yeah. Well, so there was a meta-analysis done on people looking at probability distributions, and what that means is a study of a bunch of other studies. Mm-hmm. What they found was the very first thing that happened when people looked at a probability distribution is their brain appeared to project a feeling. So, you don't know that. You're looking at some sort of probability and thinking, is it a good idea to do this or not? Unconsciously, you're thinking, if I do this, it will feel good or
right.
not. So, starting to become aware of, if I do this, how do I think I will feel? And comparing potential feelings. If I stay in this trade, how will I feel? If I get out of this trade, how will I feel? And as opposed to what will happen and how much money I'll make. That's the risk management piece of it. The question you actually asked me, though, was about the social piece of it. So at the end of the day, like, all anyone actually cares about is an accurate prediction of what someone else will pay for whatever you're long or whatever they'll sell whatever you're short in the future.
Right.
Like, if you could know the answer to that, you'd throw out all your charts or all your analytics. If you could just know, 5 minutes or 5 hours, 5 days, someone's going to pay this for Apple or that for oil or whatever. So the brain research shows that social cognition is actually what's really happening in people who are good at predicting where price is going.
Yeah.
So you can also get overt or specific about predicting other people. So I've had traders who, make maps of who they think they're trading against and make it a habit to say what are other people or groups feeling or perceiving, or what are other people or trading groups likely to do in reaction to this or that event.
Yeah.
And it doesn't give you an absolute answer. It just puts you consciously in the kind of thinking that your brain is doing unconsciously anyway.
Yeah. And so that's that theory of mind approach where you're basically, you said you're thinking about the other side and what they're doing.
Yeah. If I'm going to get along here, what's going to make someone buy this, or will someone buy this from me for more?
Right.
Not is the price going to go up?
Yep.
Will that other trader I know pay more for this tomorrow? So that's a totally different question, and you think about it totally differently.
Yeah.
Like, to think about it feels different than to think about, will the price go up?
And would you, because it seems to me like if you're thinking about that, is that also not taxing though from you, just from a decision making perspective? If I'm having to make that many judgment calls about, all right, what do I think these people are? Are they hiding their stuff over? Are they hiding orders over here? Are they waiting for me to get out there? Does it just introduce another whole, another whole stream of information that I'm going to have to think about?
Well, if you really had to think about all the possibilities, yes. But I submit that you don't really have to do that. That because unconsciously your brain recognizes that markets are social prediction.
Yeah.
That it's another person, it's a global poker game, right?
Yeah.
So your brain recognizes that. So I think just opening your thinking up to what your brain's already recognizing. It's not that you have to have the perfect, absolute, accurate answer.
Yeah.
It's opening up your awareness to the fact that there is an answer to the social question. And if you know what your unconscious is perceiving, chances are you're likely to make a better judgment call.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And, if you think about it, all you really want to do is you want to cut out some of your worst trades and you want to extend some of your best trades.
Yeah.
And so, no one tactic is the perfect answer for doing any of that. But if a tactic helps you cut some of the worst trades short, helps you keep some of the best trades longer, the difference multiplies relatively quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's a game of, in other words, it's at the psychological edges that make the difference in the mathematical edges of your profitability.
I like the way you put that. And you talked about, how is it that you want to feel when you trade? And you wrote I can't remember if it was an article in your blog or maybe it was in the book, but you talked about how in trading there's a good chance you're gonna feel bad. I think like a 70% chance you're probably gonna feel bad. Right. And I read that and I'm like, yeah, that's absolutely true. That's why I always feel bad most of the time. So can you share that? Share that idea?
I didn't really realize this until I started coaching people. But the bottom line is you're almost always going to feel bad because
right.
a loser is going to make you feel bad most of the time. Maybe not really bad, but at least a little bad.
Yeah.
And if a trader thinks about it, a winner is usually going to make you feel bad because it's the rare, at least on some level, because it's the rare occurrence that you get out at a really great point, and you get most of the move, and you don't feel like you could have gotten more or you could have given up less.
Right.
So people think, oh, winners should make me feel good. Then they have a winner, and they don't even realize that they don't feel good because they think they're supposed to feel good.
Right.
And then, they don't really feel that good. They're frustrated with it on some level, and then they don't realize that feeling, and so then that feeling leads to another action, which is usually a trade, which usually helps them get back some of their winner.
Right.
So if you just go into it realizing that you're going to feel somewhat disappointed a lot of the time, then you're less likely to act out that disappointment. And it's less likely to be as disappointing because you actually know it and are expecting it.
Yeah, that's a funny game of expectations, right? If you just let yourself know up front that, yeah, it's a very good chance that whatever happens, I'm not going to feel great. And just be willing to accept that. I think it's a big differentiator, a big distinction there.
Well, and then it also reduces the chances of, when you do feel disappointed, of feeling, even more disappointed.
Yeah, like you need to go back in and prove something or make myself feel better somehow.
Yeah, so then the energy of the disappointment doesn't present such a risk.
Yeah. And so, do you ever give guidance to people like, well, how should people feel when they trade? Is it from this Zen-like state, or is it, or you just say, hey, have whatever feelings you want to have? What's your take on that?
Well, I'm totally about you have whatever feelings you have.
Yeah. And
then if certain feelings are really hard not to act on, or they're really causing you to make repetitive mistakes, then let's figure out ways to understand and deal with those feelings.
Yeah.
So that you can recognize the feelings you do want to act on.
Right.
As a different type of experience. But I'm way less about trying to intentionally, purposely create like a positive state of mind than I am about like helping people remove the negative, because then I think what's left is the positive.
I like that.
I think when you focus too much on trying to have the positive, you miss the messages of the negative, and
right.
They just get bigger and louder and messier. And
yeah. Because you hear a lot of people, they're in positive affirmation mode all day long, right?
Yeah.
Which is, I think, is maybe going on the other end of the spectrum, which maybe it's that bounces somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of pop psychology, and there's even academic psychology about positive thinking, but I think it ends up failing most people. Mm-hmm. One reason it fails is when it fails early on, you don't realize that the modality is wrong. You think it's
yeah.
So it has a tendency, when it doesn't work for people, it has the ironic effect of making that person feel bad about themselves.
Even worse, yeah.
Yeah. And then they feel like, oh, I'm really supposed to be positive. Well, I really can't be positive.
Right.
It's really slippery slope.
Yeah,
it's really slippery slope.
Oh, that's a great point. And so, how do you tie in, I've seen you write about, what you call it, emotion analytics. So how does this kind of tie in? Does this tie in a bit where you can kind of track your emotions over time or your feelings over time and seeing, like you said, what's working, what's not working?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to this intuition or impulse, or integral or incidental. And then within incidental, you have, feelings from the last trade, feelings from something else going on in your life in the moment, or feelings from your past.
Yeah.
And being able to mitigate the influence of those incidental feelings so that you're left with more intuitive, which are really unconscious pattern recognition or expert knowledge feelings. Mm-hmm. And you can say, that inkling of a feeling that I should get out of this trade now.
Right.
Is accurate, as opposed to that it's just the fear of missing out, which is the fear of giving back.
Right.
And again, like I said, it's not about getting it perfect. It's just about it helping you get better at the edges, because it then it builds on itself too.
Yeah.
You know, if you get a tiny little bit better at parsing those feelings and choosing which ones to act on and which ones mean you should walk away from the screen. Every time you do that, and it helps your bottom line, it gets a little bit, starts to get a little bit easier.
Yeah.
To do it more. Again, back to the golf analogy. It's like, small muscle training.
Yeah. And maybe we can just we can talk about this topic a little bit more, because I was talking to Steve Ward on the podcast last month, and he has reference or quote in his book, where he quotes your book, about just the difference between intuition or real intuition and that feeling of impulse. And you just talked about it there already. So what is that difference? Because people are always talking about developing or cultivating their intuition, but some people just can't seem to tell the difference between what an impulse is versus what a true intuition is. Do you have some thoughts around that? How do you tell the difference between the two?
Intuition is very calm, for one. It's just like your phone number.
Yeah.
The sun rises in the east, or you just know, and it doesn't really have much energy associated with it. You have to do it.
Yeah.
An impulse tends to have energy associated with it. Because it's really about acting out some feeling.
Yeah.
Intuition is much more actually about knowledge.
Okay.
Some people will call it felt knowledge.
Okay.
An impulse is about resolving a feeling.
I like that. Okay. And then how do you cultivate intuition? Do you have any ideas around, all right, so let's say I want to be a more intuitive trader. Do you have any thoughts around how to begin to develop that area, or those kind of that feeling knowledge?
Well, I think you track it. You have to keep track of when you think you have an intuitive feeling, and then if you're right or not.
Right.
I once did an exercise where I turned off everything on my screens but the price ladder for like a week. And like I'd just watch the price ladder, and then I'd go in the other room and say, where do I think it's going to be? I'd even be gone for 5 or 10 minutes and say, where do I think it's going to be? And it's astounding how you could be right. And you don't even know how you're right.
Right.
So, that's a very trading specific, but you can also do it outside of trading. Like, keep track of when you feel like you know something, when you think there's a felt knowledge, and how often is it accurate.
Yeah.
Because it's about becoming aware of it and then having confidence in it. Yeah.
Because I think a lot of it, I'll speak for myself. Like I think, I've recognized, in a similar situation where you just talked about there, where you kind of have that feeling that price is going to go a certain place, but then you just don't have the cojones or the will to actually put it on.
Yeah.
But I guess it's like you said, it's just about, all right, let's just play this game and just track it and see.
I think there are market replay tools now, and so I do think getting yourself in situations where you can answer these questions without pressure.
Yeah.
So like my exercise of just watching the price ladder for days, which turned into a week, where you don't feel like you have to make a trade or get it right, but so you're spending time studying yourself essentially.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah. Well, we're wrapping. We're getting towards the end of the show, so maybe Denise, I'll just ask a couple of quick questions before we wrap things up here. So I'm very curious, since you do a lot of writing and you have a great book. What are the top recommended books that you often recommend to traders? It doesn't have to be just trading related, but I'm curious. Do you have any favorite books you often recommend to other traders?
Just about anything David Eagleman writes.
Does.
The first one being Incognito.
Okay.
That's my big recommendation.
That's your go-to. Okay. Incognito. Excellent. Thank you.
And then, now it's so much about like there's all this stuff now about how we think with our gut.
Right.
So back to the whole health thing and like finding what diet works for you and sleep pattern works for you and what break pattern works for you.
Yeah.
Although I'm having, there's a zillion books I could recommend there, but I'm not giving you one specific.
Okay. Any favorites you want to throw out there? Or?
Nah. Because another thing I'm coming to realize is that diet in particular is a very individualized
Absolutely.
thing. So
yeah,
I make a generic recommendation.
Yeah, so true. We've had talks about this on the podcast in the past about how diet being such a key influencer, and each person's so different.
Yeah. Just encourage everyone to figure it out.
You just gotta play with it. I've played with tons of different diets myself. Like right now, I'm doing ketosis, so it's kind of ketogenic. Right. But I've done everything in between. But yeah, you got to figure out what works for you and not be too dogmatic, because like you said, it's so individualized.
Yeah.
And maybe you can share this. So, do you have any projects that you're working on that you want to share with the audience, or is there anything you'd like the audience to check out before we wrap?
In the near future, we'll be coming out with a social cognition trader brain exercise with Bloomberg Trade Book. It's be a kind of a fun thing that we'll end up putting in the newsletter and on Twitter. We're doing talent assessment for the Trading X Factor, which is related to the social cognition and self-awareness. I am working on adding to the coursework that we have on our website, but I can't guarantee an availability date.
Okay. And I believe right now you have 4 courses, is that right? From level 1 to level 4?
Yeah, I think we just actually changed. I'm redoing one and finishing up another, so I think there's really only 3 on there right now.
Okay. Awesome. And if people have enjoyed our conversation today, where's the best place they can stay in contact with you, follow you, read your stuff?
Well, you should sign up for the Psych Capital tricks and tips on our homepage, which is thethinkgroup.net.
Okay.
And then you can always send us an email at think@thethinkgroup.net.
Awesome. And we'll definitely post those links on our resources page that'll go along with this podcast. But Denise, I want to just thank you for your time today. I know we're right at the end of our time today, so thank you so much for appearing on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And as usual, for the audience, you can find the show notes from today's podcast, the transcript, and all the resources, including the books, the one book that Denise mentioned here, by going to thetradingedge.org/episode 24. Denise, thank you again. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Trading Edges podcast. We've taken this interview and summarized all the big ideas so that you can take action. Just head over to thetradingedge.org/podcast to find the show notes, transcript, resources, and to continue the conversation.